And with that, I want to welcome on my first guest tonight, J. Michael Waller. He's a senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome back, Michael. Thanks for being here tonight.
Nice to be back.
Great. So listening to the hearing today, did you get the feeling that we're living in very consequential times, that either the government will stave off one of the greatest threats to freedom of speech in our lifetimes, or perhaps they'll capitulate to it?
Yes, it seems to be a capitulationist mood to crack down on free speech, and that it's almost okay with a lot of journalists as well who make their living off free speech. So to hear even a flirtation with this idea is really alarming.
And do you think that we're becoming more and more like China in this regard, that the corrupt ruling elite, they'll let us have our creature comforts, but when it comes to having real diverse opinion of thought, they're not going to allow us to have that? Is that what we're kind of seeing right now?
Yeah, well, we're very different from China, obviously, but the point you're trying to make, I think, is very valid, where most people really don't care about issues unless it directly affects them. It's a relative small part of the population that gets very immersed in larger issues, but as long as we're comfortable and we have to compromise on certain things, it's going to be okay. And that if it means my neighbor has to be denied freedom of speech, it's okay because it's for the greater good.
And do you think Congressman Scalise's testimony today, I believe it was very powerful, and in many ways it combats the narrative that this is purely because of misinformation and the danger of misinformation, because again, they're trying to go back to what happened on January 6th. And yet Congressman Scalise, he was someone who nearly died from a gunman who in many ways you could argue was radicalized by what he heard coming from left-wing media outlets. And never once did we hear from the right, from conservatives or from Republicans or even from the congressman himself to shut down these outlets.
Right. You never heard anybody say shut down MSNBC or to silence Bernie Sanders just because they goaded a guy into grabbing an AR-15 and shooting up members of Congress. You don't have that. People realize there are disturbed individuals out there and there are extremists out there, but nobody until recently, in our lifetimes, has seriously come down and said censor people's points of view.
Now,
and censor facts. That's the worst part.
Well, you're exactly right. And when it comes down to what happened on January 6th, because like I said, this hearing spawns from this, part of our government's response to what happened on January 6th. We also saw another hearing in the Senate yesterday in which your report from what you saw on the ground that day was actually entered into the record by Senator Ron Johnson. Tell me a little bit about what you had in that report and what was entered into the record.
Well, first of all, One American News was the first to interview me on this when I wrote that piece that came out from the Center for Security Policy and then later appeared in the Federalist. These were my first-hand views of having been on the scene on January 6th on the west front of the Capitol, leading up to what became the riot and the break-in at the Capitol. So these were my own notes to myself, really, as a post-report that I never intended to make public, but I wanted to write it down before being influenced by outside news and reporting and so forth. So a week later, I decided, why not just post it? So I posted it, and Senator Johnson accurately quoted from my article and accurately summarized it. And he said that I had written that there were 4 different sort of organized cell groups that I had observed leading up to the attack on the Capitol, one of which was a left-wing fake Trump protesters. What the media did and what a lot of these politicians did was to say falsely that Senator Johnson and I were floating a conspiracy theory that the left wing was behind this as fake Trumpers to invade the Capitol. That's completely false. I never said that. And in fact, the article which Senator Johnson put in there for the record for everybody to read, I specifically said I never saw those left-wingers cause any trouble at all. But look at all the news, so-called news. I mean, the Washington Post wrote a whole article about it and never bothered to contact me until I got the author, Aaron Burke, on Twitter last night, and finally I challenged him. I said, how come you never even bothered to call me? These journalists are just lazy, and they are happy to just grab onto a same narrative. All of them are of the single mindset. Grab something that's pulled completely out of context, call it a conspiracy theory, and discredit it, and don't bother even reading the original source.
So what you're telling me is that the mainstream media, the very ones who were supporting and cheerleaders for shutting down OAN for spreading misinformation, they allege that they were spreading misinformation about you and never seemed to care at all that they were doing so.
Well, they were spreading disinformation. I mean, misinformation is when you make a mistake. Disinformation is when you purposely disinform somebody. And what these journalists were doing were disinforming. Some of them might have been misinforming just because they're lazy. But this pack journalism where there's very little independent thinking, very little independent inquiry, and a sheer laziness of even looking at the original source and then willfully grabbing a senator's comments out of context and spinning that into a false storyline, that's disinformation. And that's what these news organizations were doing. And Whoopi Goldberg had a conniption this morning on The View, I'm told.
Oh, and speaking of this disinformation, some of the witnesses that we saw, like Soledad O'Brien today, she's someone who worked for Al Jazeera, a company that is funded by Qatar, a country that also funds real extremists worldwide like Hamas and Hezbollah and some other pretty nasties out there. The Muslim Brotherhood is another example. She was on testifying about disinformation and misinformation as if she's some pure unbiased journalist. We also saw an MSNBC analyst, someone who on his social media pages had said that ISIS should target some of Trump towers. And these are the people who are propping themselves up on their high horses, on their soapboxes to look down on us. What did you make of this choice in witnesses that we saw today?
Well, first, it's terrible for Congress to have unregistered foreign agents working for a totalitarian one-man dictatorship who supports the terrorists who are killing us come up as a witness, like Soledad O'Brien. But second, it's against every standard of journalistic ethics for a working journalist to come and testify in a public forum on a policy matter. Unless it's a criminal case or something where eyewitness testimony is required, a real working journalist would never testify before a congressional panel. The editors and the publisher would never allow those individuals to testify, and it would be shameful for the journalist himself or herself to do so. So it really speaks to the total decline in mainstream journalism in Washington.
And in many ways, the creeping influence from a lot of these outside foreign funding. So as we're talking about Qatar, but we also saw through the election season until now, China, a lot of money coming from the Communist Party there, state-controlled entities in China as well, putting ads in some of our papers and paying some, like the Washington Post, for example, some of the ads in those outlets. And in a lot of ways, it has a lot of influence on what's happening here. But J. Michael Waller, it's always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It was nice to be with you.